Welcome in. This is my Victoria 3 Ultimate Beginner's Guide. There are time cards below if you'd like to jump around between different sections if you need a refresher, but all the sections do talk to each other, so I'd encourage you to watch the video through. Victoria 3 is a complicated beast, but in this 30-minute guide, I'll hopefully teach you everything you need to know to play successfully and hopefully win some Victoria 3 games. Do consider subscribing and joining us for more, and without any further ado, let's jump straight in. The most logical place for us to start is probably by taking a look at the markets, which of course we can do over on the left-hand side of our screen, or with these wonderful trade lenses down the bottom. The first thing that we might want to do is remind ourselves that there are 4 different types of goods that we're dealing with here. Staple goods that are necessary, industrial goods for our manufacturing, luxury goods like these purple ones here, things like tobacco, sugar, liquor, and then finally military goods. We can filter by different types up here to get a feel for what they're like. But crucially, I'd suggest you filter the market price tab here. This will show you, we'll use opium as an example, goods that are way overpriced within your market. With that information, we can figure out what to build or trade or import. More on those in a little bit. The other thing we can do is actually familiarize ourselves with what our market is. If you head down to the lenses at the bottom and navigate to the trade lens, you'll get a different view for actions that you can take, but also for all of these different goods and, crucially, import and export routes for trade. If I select a good, coal might be a reasonable one, we can get a feel for how we can create trade routes, how productive they'll be. We could also navigate back to the market screen and do that here as well. One thing of particular note that you might want to do is look into a good. Let's take opium, for example. It's an interesting enough example. And then, as you zoom out, you can see the different potentials, production, and consumption of each good. If we use opium as an example, you can see that there is potential for it around here in the East India Company. The production of it, likewise, is happening in and around here. The consumption, though, is spreading much further afield into China, and interestingly, over here as well. Ultimately, it is the supply and demand of these goods that's therefore impacting the price within our market. In this case, I'm playing as Spain, so it's the Spanish market, of course, that we're operating within. Any extension outside of that market has to be done via trade routes. We can enact them at a cost of bureaucracy. More on that a little later in the video. We'll also need convoys if we're sailing overseas. Or we could change our policies here on the trade route screen to increase or remove tariffs on imports and exports. Finally, when it comes to trade routes, you can see down the bottom, you can establish a new import or export route down here. Zooming in on Spain a little bit, we get a feel for the different territories or states that make up our country. If I navigate to the buildings menu, we can see where the goods and resources that we were talking about before are actually playing out. What kind of buildings do we have here? They're divided into 4 categories: urban for the more advanced stuff, higher up in supply chains like food industries, clothing. Then we have rural. That tends to be resources, food, gold, coffee, tobacco, you name it. Development is all about our military, naval bases, and infrastructure. And lastly, there's the construction center. This one effectively will help you build things better or faster, but like any other sector, it also requires goods. You can hover over any one of these, just like I'm doing here, to get a feel for the goods that they'll require and the employment that they'll create for our populations. We'll have a look at them in a moment. I do like to expand the construction center, even though it does cost us a little bit, and we'll need to make sure that we have enough basic goods and supply to not go crazy on the price. But it does tend to be a good idea, particularly in states where we're going to be investing in relatively heavily. As I queue up a building, in this case a construction center, you get a feel for how long it will take me to build it, and also that will shove it up the top right here of my screen. It will, while I'm constructing it and the game is active and in play, also cost us a lot. Hovering over the money up in the top here will show you just where everything is being spent, and you can see that construction goods are currently costing us £6,000 more than. That's a lot of this deficit. If you are finding that you're struggling a bit with your construction, you can pause it at any time. Pausing it will, of course, halt the development, but it may also save you a few dollars in the long run. Something else to note about the buildings is that they all have certain things that you can tinker with. Their production methods, for example, can change the quality, quantity, or overall productivity of a building. It can also change exactly what you're producing and how it's being funded. These different production methods and funding mechanisms increase employment and have all kinds of other impacts on your populations. So, if there are certain interest groups you're trying to coerce or lift up, it might be important that you take a look at how these buildings are being owned or operated and where that money is going. We'll talk more, of course, about these populations slightly later in the video. There are a couple of other things that you can do to your buildings. You can expand them, of course, by adding additional ones here in this menu, just like we were doing in the previous. You can also choose to subsidize a building if your laws allow. That will, of course, cost the state a little bit of extra money, but it may be necessary to provide jobs or crucially needed goods that you can't get access to elsewhere. Finally, you can also set buildings within certain group types to automatically upgrade if they're in profit and otherwise, generally speaking, doing well. When it comes to our development or our sort of more militaristic buildings, here again we can add improvements, but this time, of course, it's about the gear that the infantry are using. Take note, of course, that as we upgrade and move through, we'll have different requirements and different jobs offered. On the urban tab, the more advanced one, there are a few interesting things to note. The urban center is one building that you can't add anything to. It's actually really one of the only ones. This upgrades through urbanization, which you'll achieve as you urbanize, build more buildings, and change certain laws and relevance of interest groups. Another one that you'll want to be aware of from the get-go is government administration. These buildings provide bureaucracy and taxation capacity. Bureaucracy is one of the other 4 resources up the top here. You can see on this screen at the moment that I'm using my bureaucracy to do all kinds of things, like keep my generals, trade routes, laws, and institutions active, as well as, generally speaking, keep my populations incorporated within the state. Take note, there are often other interesting urban buildings that you can build down the line as well. Universities are an obvious one, providing urbanization, innovation, and qualifications to the people. But also there are some rather more unique and interesting buildings down the bottom here that can provide all sorts of other things, as well as unique jobs to your pops, should you require them. So as I navigate back to my production lens here and I take a look at the different agricultural production we've got going on, the different resources, or lack thereof, it makes me think, what is all this for? Well, of course, it's for improving our state, improving the lives of our people, maybe building a military, expanding, who knows. But crucially, though, it is really about the population, because another crucial element of Victoria 3, and you'll need this if you want to have any kind of success, is the people. You can click in on any state within your territory to get a feel for how many people are living in it and their standard of living, as well as what they expect. Fall too far below this and they'll start to turn into radicals, and radicals will be a big problem. They can lead right the way up to revolts, revolutions within. They can completely dissolve and ruin your game, so you do need to handle them with some care. Navigating to the population tab and you'll get a look at these wonderful charts. In here, we'll see a variety of things, including interest groups that we'll have a look at in a little bit. More importantly, though, I'd like to navigate to the side here, the F9 population screen, where we get a feel overall, not just within an individual state, but what does our country look like? Scrolling down a little further, and we can see where most of our people are working. In this case, they're largely peasants and labourers, making up the majority of our country. We are an interesting one in terms of political strength. Fairly mixed bag, but a few key groups rise to the top. And of course, we can see our religion and culture screen here as well. This might be important down the line if we go to, say, take over more land, and the people there don't align with our culture or religion at all. It might be more difficult to keep them both under control or happy and living good, productive lives. Hovering over one of the groups will reveal just who lives within it, and as you might expect, inside of our upper strata here, for example, we have capitalists and aristocrats, and then down in the lower strata we have our clerks, farmers, labourers. In the middle sits engineers, clergymen, and academics. But the point here is that you can hover over each group and get a feel for all sorts of things, including where they're working. Peasants are currently in subsistence buildings, limiting them to a low standard of living. Using that information and what we've already discussed, I might then head back to my buildings and have a look and think, what's going on here? Why are there so many subsistence farms? Look at this, 759. I know that populations working on these farms tend to not be as productive as the rest, and they also tend to live a lower quality of life. So it might be on me here then to perhaps change some laws, or maybe create more jobs for them by building more plantations. We can also, of course, hover over different types of buildings to figure out who they employ. In this case, our tobacco plantations use slaves as laborers, so too do our gold mines. You can see on our fishing wharves, they produce fish, they increase employment for people like shopkeepers and laborers, and also provide a little bit of that urbanization. We can use this information to figure out what buildings will provide not only the goods that we may need, but also what jobs will be provided. You can use that to keep people happy and lift up their interests, or alternatively make them unhappy and push them down. While owners of buildings will take dividends and their employees, as well as the owners, may take some wages, it's important to also realize that populations can change jobs or migrate depending on, say, the requirements of them, their needs, their skill sets, and also other player controlled actions. One, for example, might be to head down to the political lens. Of course, we'll touch on the politics and military side in just a little bit, but there are actions in here that you can carry out. Things like decrees, for example. These have a direct impact on terrain, on manufacturing, throughput, assimilation, education, you name it. So there are direct ways that you can use your authority as a leader, the third one of our resources up the top here, second in order, of course, to directly impact things. Authority is used not just for these direct decrees, but it can be used for other things. You can see here at the moment, I'm also using it on my budget screen to enact some consumption taxes. These will also, of course, have an impact on my populations. It'll make the good more expensive, but bring in slightly more revenue for me. I can use more authority to tax other things and have that exact same effect, adjusting its price, its supply and demand, but also the happiness and willingness of my people. Over on our politics tab, the very first one on the list, and perhaps for very good reason, we get a feel for the politics of our nation. Both who's in charge, in this case it's a monarch, but your experience may very well differ, as well as the different interest groups that our populations come together to form based on their collective sort of ideologies. And these groups, by the way, actually have a direct impact on our nation and on our yields. So you can see at the moment, thanks to the approval of the Catholic Church being at least at 5, and them not being marginalized, I'm receiving their slightly positive trait plus 10% authority, divine right. However, you can see that the intelligentsia at the minute are unhappy with me at -5. Once they've reached that threshold, we receive a penalty, -10% to our nation's prestige. Jump inside of any interest group, and you'll also get a feel for their clout. This is kind of how cool they are, but more importantly, it's their overall power within the nation, and it is literally just over 100 as a percentage. You can use that authority that we talked about earlier to bolster or suppress the clout of an interest group. This will reduce their power and sway within government. While the names of the groups may change depending on the nation you're playing, a lot of them will remain consistent across playthroughs in Victoria 3. Clicking into each group, or at least hovering over it, gives you a feel for the kind of people who it supports. You can also, if you hover over the popularity, get a feel for what they like and what they don't like, i.e. the laws that they endorse or oppose. The other thing to note is when you click into them, by navigating across their different tabs, you get a really good feel for just where they're working, just the kind of changes they want to make, and also any sneaky modifiers that they may be giving or taking. The most important information about your interest groups, though, are probably their ideologies. There's a lot of words and detail here, absolutely, and the government screen makes it a little bit easier to manage. But it's important to note that these groups have wildly different visions for the country. And when you go in here and try and reform a government, which you can do after an election or sometimes at your own will, you'll get a feel for why it matters. Why do these interest groups matter? Well, because they want to pass certain laws, and you can only pass them if you have them here inside of your government. You'll notice that this will also impact the amount of legitimacy and the number of radical populations we have living within our society. The legitimacy of our government impacts how quickly we can pass laws. Laws, of course, being over here on the next tab within this wonderful political system. Here we can change basically the entire structure of our society. On the left-hand side, power, things like the role of the state, who leads, how we vote. Next, we have the economy. This sets everything from trade to taxation policy, colonization, our police force, education, you name it. It's all in here, except, of course, for human rights. This is everything from freedom of speech to what we do with our women and children and welfare. Finally, this completes the sort of political trifecta that's available in Victoria 3. Now, at any point, you can see which laws are available to be changed or which laws you can change based off, you guessed it, who's in power. It is the interest groups that are in power that determine which laws you can or can't pass. In this case, we could take a look at an example. Currently, we are a monarchy. We could look to try and change to be a presidential republic or a parliamentary republic. We could take a look at maybe something a little quote-unquote easier to change. We could change our local police force to be none or dedicated. You'll notice that anything we decide to change has a % chance and a time. That time, again, is impacted by our legitimacy. The percentage chance is from supporting interest groups. Hopefully, then, you start to get a feel for how this plays out. You can see different interest groups support or reject laws, whether active or proposed future laws, like this dedicated police force one here. Loads of groups support it, one doesn't. It's likely to advance after debate. There may be events that come up as we move through the game, but by and large, if you have a pretty strong backing of support behind parties who are in power, whether they made it there themselves or you forced them in there, then you should be able to push through some change. Laws can obviously enable or disable a lot of things and really impact the prosperity of your nation, economy, all of that good stuff. Labor rights here, serfdom, may be a good example of that. But outside of that, there is one final part to this wonderful political puzzle, and that's the institutions. You see, by passing laws, like our law enforcement one, for example, where we would have initially moved from having no police to having a police force, allows us to have institutions. We can also upgrade these institutions, and they'll have all kinds of effects, not just on the state itself. For example, the health system here reduces mortality of our pops. Maybe both. But also it can change the strength of different groups. So you can also impact who's in power by changing the institutions themselves. Important to note, though, these will cost you bureaucracy to upgrade. Again, a reminder that our buildings and other things can play in here. One that we haven't talked about too much, but is a pressing task as we start the game, is no active research. That's right, the technology tree is another little piece of this puzzle. It will sort of automatically work its way through using that weekly innovation score that you're probably producing, either from base value, previous discoveries, universities, or overall literacy and education of your pops. You'll be able to unlock new, shiny things. Things like the railways, all sorts of very important and useful technologies. There are obviously so many ways that those technological discoveries can be used, but one simple one might be in your military development. If you go to your barracks, you may want to upgrade to skirmish infantry, for example. Or maybe it's your artillery that's letting you down a bit, and with your military upgrades and hopefully upgraded supply lines as well, you might be able to get some better gear going. Finally, panning over to Brazil, we're going to take a look at diplomacy, military, and war, the last sort of main section of this video. I moved myself to Brazil, if you haven't seen my other video, because they actually start the game in the middle of 2 conflicts, so it seems like a great nation to assess. Among many things, our military power, or at least the amount that we have available and where it's available, is of course impacted by the whole network that we're trying to build, buildings being one crucial part. Barracks and conscription centers, most importantly, will add, as you can see, offense, defense, and all sorts of other good things, as well as increase our overall training rate and army power projection. This is where we get our army from, and it also helps determine relative power on the battlefield. Of course, we can fight at the seas as well with our admirals, where we have naval bases and also ports for infrastructure and convoys. On the left-hand side F5 military tab, though, you get a better feel for how to actually use the military. Here we see our option to mobilize our generals and activate our conscripts. Basically, pull everybody out from those buildings, bring out our soldiers. We've got some front lines. We literally do have a couple of active front lines. We also see our generals. These are the people in charge, the ones who we direct as players. We can mobilize them individually to take out their individual mobilized or garrison battalions. And we can also interact with them in other ways. They are, like other people in this game, leaders or characters. They have interest group roles, ideologies that they bring, and cultures. We can retire them, to get rid of them. We could promote them to increase their battalion command limit. Interest group as well also gets a little increase out of that of note. And if you find you have some spare ships, or maybe on the army tab, some spare troops, you can recruit additional generals to your HQs, the army headquarters that you've built within your strategic regions. Here I have the Brazil HQ. I could recruit a new general. Let's say maybe I like the industrialist one. He'll command 6 dudes out of 20. Fantastic. And now he's appeared over on the right-hand side of my screen here if I want to quickly jump in and grab an army, mobilize, and send it to a front line. Important to note, by the way, you can put other things over on the right there. You can, of course, get rid of all of these notifications that you're probably going to get a lot of, but also you could add, say, interest groups over onto the right-hand side if you wanted to have interest groups quickly at your fingertips. Likewise, states and markets within your territory as well. Okay, I hear you. I know what you're thinking. Before I go fighting, how did I start fighting? What if I'm not playing as Brazil? Yes, there is an important thing that we should probably talk about first, and that's the system that underpins warfare, or more broadly, the diplomatic system. Here, I'm jumped into a game as Persia, and let's say I want to set my sights or engage with one of my neighbors. To do that, I need to engage with them as a country. Here I'll get a variety of options. I can improve or damage relationships with them. Could be good to make some powerful friends overseas. Get rid of their diplomats, declare a rivalry, or ultimately look to make them my vassal or conquer them. Of course, these options will depend on who you're playing and your laws and limits as well. Instant diplomatic plays can be carried out straight away at probably no cost. However, ongoing diplomatic plays like this one here, improve relations, have a maintenance cost. That maintenance cost is our fourth and final resource up the top here. It's our influence. As you can see at the moment, I have a pretty good balance of influence. I could use some of that to maintain international relations with other people, most importantly. And actually, looking at this one, I've got a lot to spend, so I might as well. Navigating down to the bottom, the diplomatic lens, you can get a feel for who's your mate and who's not. You can see the color coding system works perfectly to illustrate that. Here we can declare interests in a region. What this will do is then let us move through and have greater engagement in that region in future. One example, if we want to take a territory, we're going to need to first have a declared strategic interest in the region. Because we're a relatively minor nation, we actually only have but one interest, and at the moment it's declared on this region. You can see all of these other ones we don't. If we were a more powerful, prestigious, major nation, we might have more declared interests that we could put out there and potentially go on a big old rampage around the world. But honestly, one will be enough for us at the minute to try and build up a bit of prestige, maybe some notoriety. Let's use the conquer state interaction on this neighboring state here in Turkmenia as an example of how something like this could play out. When we go to start making it, we can see other countries that may or may not be interested. We could improve our relations with them if we wanted to bring them on side or do a variety of other things. Let's confirm the play and have a look at what happens. Up in the top here, you can see the diplomatic play start to play out. There are 3 different phases: an escalation phase at the beginning, an ending phase, and then the meat in the middle. During these 2 opening phases, I could also, if I want to, add additional war goals. Maybe I want to conquer extra states. This will add infamy against me, damaging my relations with other people, and it will cost me some war maneuvers, so I can't do it indefinitely and forever, but I could look to add additional goals there if I want. Now we've moved into the second phase. This is the escalation phase. Here the Sway Countries tab opens, and potential countries that might want to come in this case militarily, to engage in combat, can be swayed either way. Having a look in here at the Russians, it's unlikely that I can sway them here at all. We're not particularly well aligned. There's a lack of perhaps obligations, trade, or even good relations with them, so they're not keen to come in. The positive news is that they're not coming in on either side of the fight. You can see nobody has brought anyone in. It looks like this could very well be a 1v1 situation. With the war goals set and the escalation phase nearly done, we move towards the final phase, the war phase. And it's at this point where, to hark back to our Brazilian footage from earlier on, it might be time for us to start mobilizing our armies. We're in the escalation phase. Things are getting kind of tense. The front line, you can see, has already been drawn, and we have an estimated 66% advantage. We have 48 units, they have 20. If there were multiple front lines or we wanted to manually control it, of course we do, at least a little bit. We could jump into the military tab here and mobilize all of our generals. We could also activate our conscripts. You can see here the different regions where they're available and the capacity, and we can just go through and activate them. We'll need generals to command them. We've got one leading everyone. This one is relatively well promoted. It has a capacity of 75. We should be okay. Now we will mobilize our generals, adding a little bit of a running cost, and we can't undo it until the war is done. And then I can select my orders. I can advance a front, defend a front, or hold fast. In this case, we didn't even have to fight them, because it played out in a pretty interesting way. As you can see down the bottom here, they backed down. So we went to all that trouble, mobilized our armies, and we didn't even need to. Our power was too much. No friends came to join them. They thought, you know what, we'll concede, take the L, and give up the territory. And now Persia grows just that little bit bigger. Back over here with our Brazilian friends, though, and things aren't quite as smooth. Of course, these 2 wars had already kicked off before the game began. I would suggest you do the same thing. Activate your conscripts if you don't mind activating them. Mobilize your generals, and then you'll actually get to fight. I would suggest, again, entirely up to you, that you try and advance the fronts, in this case, as quickly as possible. The other thing you might want to do is check, again, you may have units or generals that could be recruited and assigned. You can see this guy will command 9, but it will split up my existing battalions across them. It's important to note that we don't have unlimited people. These are real units with a real cost. Our boats at sea are just as real as well, and we can, of course, send our navy out. We could do a naval invasion, but in this case, we might just raid some convoys or go for one of those other options. Your naval experiences may very well differ, though. As I move through, I'll also look to build on some of those things we've already done, like decrees to mobilize conscripts faster. I'll also move to the building menu to get some extra barracks online. That will provide us for some troops, at least for the next conflict. As I move through and look at the actual front line here, where I've mobilized my units and sent them on an aggressive stance, you can see the impact playing out on the battlefield. My morale higher than theirs, their battalions failing. And as you can see by the slider, individual battles play out in real time in Victoria 3, and you can watch and hope that your units, their equipment, their generals with their various traits and leadership styles, and, of course, your supply lines, all of the things that we've talked about and tried to build on in this video, how do they play out? In this case, reasonably well. We're turning the tide, winning individual battles to ultimately win the war. It's of course playing out in a familiar kind of war support-esque system where we're trying to drive them down, capturing their territory, causing them casualties. Here you'll see my battalions from my conscription centers come in, and my generals getting more and more troops to overwhelm the enemy. They are now overwhelmed. I can enforce my war goal and change this peace deal to an acceptance. And just like that, the war is over. Thank you very much for joining me today. Don't forget, you can also change a few settings like AI behavior toward players and AI aggression if you need a little bit of extra help in your first journey in Victoria 3. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you all next time.